They told you this never happened, that it couldn't have happened, that if it had, someone would have written it down, someone would have warned you. But listen carefully, because what you're about to hear was buried on purpose. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. In the spring of 1849, in one of America's most respectable cities, men vanished without leaving. Not runaways, not fugitives, not corpses. Grown men, strong, skilled, documented, simply erased from household records. The books said they were sold south. The ports said they never left. And Richmond, Virginia, chose not to ask why. This is where the lie begins. Richmond liked to imagine itself as civilized. Not the raw brutality of the cotton frontier, but refinement. Manners. God-fearing homes perched above the James River. Church Hill was the crown jewel mansions with imported wallpaper, polished silver, and women who spoke softly about charity while controlling entire human lives with a glance. These were not powerless women trapped in a man's world. These were managers of flesh, time, and silence. Understand this clearly. Power does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it wears silk. Sometimes it hosts luncheons. Between March and November of that year, 17 enslaved men were officially transferred. On paper. In reality, they never left the city. They were moved instead through parlors and sitting rooms, between houses whose owners shared bloodlines, secrets, and a mutual understanding that the rules applied to others, not to them. What formed among these women was not chaos or impulse. It was structure, routine, protocol, a private system hidden inside the public order. And the men at its center were not participants. They were instruments caught in a psychological vice where refusal meant destruction, and obedience meant something far worse. This is the part history avoids because it shatters comforting myths. The myth that cruelty only flows one way. The myth that refinement equals morality. The myth that institutions rot only at the top. What happened in Richmond wasn't an aberration, it was a revelation. And here is the truth most people never confront. Systems of control don't require monsters. They require respectable people who believe they are untouchable. As we descend further, you'll see how this arrangement was built, how it was maintained, and why its exposure terrified lawmakers more than murder ever could. Not because of what was done, but because of who did it. Stay with me. We're only at the outer door. Section 2. To understand how this could exist, you must first abandon the idea that power lives only in public offices. In Richmond, real authority moved quietly through drawing rooms and breakfast tables. The women of Church Hill did not vote, but they controlled property, schedules, reputations, and human beings. Their husbands drafted laws by day. These women enforced reality by night. Each household was a small kingdom. Ledgers recorded expenses, births, deaths, punishments. Nothing moved without a mistress's approval. An enslaved man did not belong to himself for a single hour of his life. His labor, his body, even his silence were assets to be allocated. This was not chaos. It was administration. And then something shifted. What began as private boundary violations hardened into a collective understanding. Not spoken aloud at first, only suggested through tone, through shared looks, through questions phrased as hypotheticals. What if discretion were shared? What if risk were distributed? What if the burden of secrecy became lighter because it was no longer carried alone? That is how hidden orders are born. Not through declarations, but through alignment. These women understood a dangerous truth long before modern psychology gave it a name. Isolation breaks resistance. Rotation confuses memory. Ritual normalizes the unthinkable. By moving men between homes, by embedding abuse inside routine errands and polite visits, they dissolved the possibility of proof. No single household appeared guilty. No single woman appeared responsible. Together, they became invisible. And the men trained from birth to obey were trapped in a paradox. To speak was to invite annihilation. To remain silent was to disappear slowly from themselves. Their identities fractured. They learned to divide their minds, to leave parts of themselves behind just to survive the summons. This is not about sex. It is about domination without witnesses, about turning human beings into movable shadows, about the thrill elites feel when they realize the rules they enforce on others do not bind them. History prefers villains who look like villains. It struggles with villains who look like benefactors. The women of Church Hill funded orphanages. They knelt in church. They spoke gently of virtue. And behind closed doors, they refined a system that weaponized obedience itself. Remember this as we continue. The most enduring forms of control are not loud. They are polite. They are organized. And they convince everyone watching that nothing unusual is happening at all. Secrecy requires infrastructure. And by the summer of 1849, this arrangement had evolved into something unmistakably organized. There were signals, schedules, contingency plans. Charity meetings provided cover. Ledgers were split, one reality for husbands, another for truth. Language itself was bent into a tool of concealment. We will need additional linen. Confirmation. The roses require attention. A warning. Ordinary words repurposed to coordinate something unspeakable. This is how corruption survives, by camouflaging itself inside normalcy. But no system is perfect because no system can fully erase human cost. The first cracks did not appear in public records. They appeared in posture, in eyes that no longer met other eyes, in men who returned home quieter, hollowed, as if something essential had been taken and never returned. The enslaved women noticed first. They always do. Those tasked with washing clothes, serving meals, sharing beds, they are the true intelligence network of any household. Patterns emerged. The same men, the same times, the same excuses, and the same transformation afterward. What you must understand is this. The enslaved women were placed in an impossible moral trap. Expose the abuse, and their families would be shattered through sale and punishment. Remain silent, and watch the men they loved be psychologically dismantled in slow motion. Silence became another form of violence. Within the sisterhood, confidence curdled into entitlement. What began as secrecy turned into ritual. Comparison crept in. Preferences were discussed. Efficiency improved. The men were no longer individuals, they were resources to be scheduled. This is the moment where every hidden order reveals its true nature. When the human element is fully abstracted. When suffering becomes data. When control becomes pleasurable not despite its cruelty, but because of it. And still Richmond slept. Church bells rang. Ledgers balanced. Husbands returned home none the wiser, trusting in a social order that assumed women were incapable of such orchestration. That assumption was the Brotherhood's greatest shield. But every system built on silence creates its own enemy, memory. And memory, once shared, becomes dangerous. Because there is always someone who remembers themselves. Her name was Rachel, and she had lived long enough to recognize rot when she smelled it. She had raised one of these women from infancy, rocked her to sleep, taught her to walk. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, Rachel occupied a strange position, enslaved, yet intimate, powerless, yet trusted. And it was from that fragile position that she chose to speak. Not loudly, not publicly, directly. When Rachel confronted her mistress, she did not accuse. She warned. She spoke of consequences, of corruption that spreads outward, of sins that never stay buried. What she was really saying was this: systems like yours always collapse, and they take everyone with them. The response was immediate and precise. Fear wrapped in fury, a reminder of leverage, a threat delivered with perfect clarity. Your daughter can be erased. This is how power answers truth. Rachel survived because she understood the final rule of hidden systems. They depend on fear remaining private. She carried her knowledge silently, but she was no longer alone. Others had seen, others remembered, and something subtle changed. Here is where you come in. If you are still listening, you already understand this is not just history. This is a pattern, and patterns only break when they are named. In the comments, write this phrase twice exactly as I say it. I see the structure. I see the structure. Do not explain it. Do not embellish it. Writing it is an act of recognition, because recognition is the first threat to any hidden order. What followed in Richmond was not justice. It was containment. Whispers reached the wrong ears. Questions were asked behind closed doors. Not about the men, but about exposure, about reputation, about what would happen if the wrong people learned the right things. And when elites feel threatened, they do not repent. They erase. The official response came quietly, dressed as procedure. An emergency session, restricted attendance, no public minutes. The legislature did not seek to free the men. It sought to restore order, to plug the leak, to ensure the architecture of dominance remained intact. Records were altered, transfers retroactively legitimized. Some men were sent away for real, this time sold south, removed from the city entirely. Not as punishment for disobedience, but as a sanitation measure. Evidence was being disposed of. The women were never named. Not then, not later. Their families remained pillars of society. Streets still bear their surnames. Institutions still carry their donations. This is how power launders itself through time. And the men? They vanished in the only way that truly matters, from memory. This is why stories like this feel dangerous, because they reveal something most people are trained not to see: that oppression is not sustained by monsters alone, but by systems that reward silence and punish disruption. That abuse can wear refinement. That morality, when monopolized by elites, becomes a weapon. What happened in Richmond was not an anomaly. It was a rehearsal, a demonstration of how easily humans can be reorganized into tools when accountability is removed. And here is the final truth you are meant to carry forward. The moment you learn to see structures instead of individuals, history stops being a collection of stories and becomes a map. A map of who benefits, a map of who disappears, a map of how control really works. Once you have that map, you can never be managed the same way again. By the late summer of 1849, the mechanics of the sisterhood were fully refined. It was no longer a group of women experimenting with forbidden appetites. It had become a calculated, rotating system. Each mistress knew exactly which man would be summoned, to which house, and under what pretense. The language of linen and roses became a codebook. Trusted female house slaves became lookouts, positioning themselves at windows and corridors, trained to watch for returnees, visitors, or any sign of suspicion. The orchestration was near military in its precision, and yet precision amplified the horror. The men moved not only physically but psychologically through a maze they could never escape. Every visit required compliance. Every gesture of obedience carved away pieces of self. Samuel, Isaac, and the others existed in constant mental tension. One misstep, one refusal, and consequences were brutal. Punishment, sale, or total erasure from the fragile network of family they had left. The system weaponized loyalty and fear simultaneously, creating an invisible prison within the visible one they had already occupied. The women themselves evolved too. What began as lust or curiosity transformed into a form of authority that intoxicated. Power does not demand overt violence, it thrives in secrecy. Each mistress knew she could manipulate men without fear of societal repercussions. The thrill of dominion became indistinguishable from habit. Charity and social appearances shielded them. The veneer of refinement hid the machinery beneath. They had discovered a principle older than law itself. Absolute control requires invisibility, ritual, and willing compliance from those they dominate. And somewhere, beneath the silk drapes and perfumed parlors, Life became a transaction of bodies, minds, and silence. Men were exchanged between households like commodities, but commodities that remembered their humanity. And that remembrance made them dangerous, because memory is the seed of resistance. Yet for every memory, there was a calculation. The risk to family, the threat of exposure, the impossible choice between survival and identity. The sisterhood had perfected a system that corroded moral intuition without leaving fingerprints. This is the subtlety of elite corruption. The true victims are never only those who suffer. They are also those who watch, who know, who recognize the machinery of oppression and feel powerless to stop it. Richmond's elite had weaponized the domestic sphere, and in doing so, revealed the architecture of human control itself. And now we reach the point where fear turns inward. Secrets like these breed paranoia because every action, every glance, every decision could unmask the hidden order. The sisterhood thrived in part because of trust, but trust in a system like this is fragile, always threatened by conscience. It was the enslaved women, finally, who became the unwitting sentinels. They pieced together schedules, compared absences, read the subtle cues of flushed faces, and cataloged patterns. Yet their knowledge brought no safety, it brought moral terror. To act would risk everything. To remain silent was complicity. The tension was a psychological crucible. Every whispered observation, every small act of recognition, became a negotiation with life and death. And the men themselves became ghosted versions of who they were. Their bodies remained, but their autonomy was fractured. The mastery of the mistresses over their movements, thoughts, and silences created a terror that could not be measured in beatings or chains. This was dominion via cognition, controlling the mind while leaving the flesh ostensibly free. Every glance, every command, every coded phrase chipped away at their sense of self. History ignores this kind of power because it cannot easily be quantified. But here's the truth. Real oppression is subtle. It is psychological. It is the quiet knowledge that someone can destroy your life without leaving evidence, that your own participation is both demanded and coerced. And this is why the Richmond sisterhood endured. The law, the men, society itself, the institutions all believed in a different reality, leaving the women free to construct their own. And yet, even in absolute control, entropy is inevitable. Systems built on fear and secrecy always leave traces. Small acts of defiance, overlooked signals, a conscience that refuses silence, these are the cracks that eventually split the structure. What history records as absence or anomaly is often the first evidence of that fracture. Eventually, the structure could not remain untouched. By the end of the year, the psychological toll on the men and the vigilance of the enslaved women created tension too volatile to ignore. Samuel, Isaac, and others were changed in ways that could not be disguised. Whispers reached those who could enforce consequences, and the veneer of the sisterhood's control began to peel. Yet, no public reckoning ever occurred. The men who had survived the rotation were moved, sold, or quietly absorbed into other households, their memories erased by relocation and the passage of time. The women, untouched legally and socially, returned to their charity meetings, their piano lessons, and their social rituals. Richmond's elite never faced the kind of exposure the system deserved. The legislature convened not to punish, but to sanitize. Laws were cited, transfers legitimized. Control reasserted itself. And here is the dangerous lesson. Systems of absolute control are rarely punished. They persist because institutions fear revelation more than corruption. Because elites can hide behind tradition, refinement, and ritual. Because obedience can be manufactured through fear, silence, and psychological mastery. The story of Richmond's sisterhood is not merely historical, it is archetypal. It is a blueprint for understanding power hidden behind civility, for recognizing domination cloaked in manners, for seeing how compliance can be weaponized against the human spirit. Once you understand the pattern, once you see the structures beneath the surface, you cannot unknow it. You cannot return to naivete. Somewhere in Richmond, beneath the cobblestones and the restored facades, history whispers. It tells of men erased, of women who weaponized obedience, of secrecy that built empires invisible to law. And if you are listening closely, it also whispers to you. The moment you recognize the system, the moment you see the machinery, you step outside the control it once had over you. This is knowledge few survive intact. But you, having heard it, now carry it. The map has been revealed. The structures are exposed. The forbidden is no longer silent. You will never see power in polite society the same way again.